Another problem that interferes with hearing the call and responding to the call is what I call received ideas. In other words, each soul born is born into a family. The family and the parents have nothing necessarily to do with the calling of their own children. Typically, the parents do not know the calling or the destiny of their own children. They're not supposed to, because that inside the child that is waiting to awaken is not something that is derived from the DNA of the parents. It's something that is unique to the child coming into the world, and therefore it's by definition not a derivative of the parents. And yet, because in the modern world, people don't understand that. I'll give an example. The origin of birthday candles, lighting a candle, was one candle that would be lit each time the person had a birthday, regardless of their age. And the lighting of the candle would be the recognition that they had come in when they were born with a flame inside them. And the birthday candle, which we now still do, originated as the lighting of the flame of a candle in the house of the person having the birthday, in order to recognize that a flame of life, a spirit of imagination, a part of the eternal flame came into the world with that person, and birthday gifts would be given to the genius, not to the person. I'm just showing how something could change over time. And now we think our birthday has to do with the family, for instance, which is true on one level, and that's fine. But I'm talking about something about what burns inside a person, what longs inside of a person to be seen as something lighting a path through life. That is what the birthday used to be about, the recognition that a genius, a spirit, had come into the world with each child born, and that child born was not simply a derivative of the parents, but was actually partly generated by the unseen world of spirit. And that's why some children, I was one of them, can say, I don't know what I'm doing in this family. How did I wind up in this group? And you can have parents who say, I don't know where this child came from. She's not like anyone else in the whole family. Because the actual spirit of the children is not derived or generated by the family per se. So the problem then develops that not only the family can't recognize the genius or the spirit or the calling of their own children, that's the setup, so that the children will leave home and go and try and find the calling and find their own lives. But in the meantime, the children are receiving ideas. I call it received ideas from the parents, from school, from the community. And received ideas get in the way of that core image idea that's trying to awaken from inside the person. And so if a person has certain received ideas about how life works, or if there's a heavy dose of some kind of fundamentalist belief system or something, that will obscure the spirit that's trying to awaken in that child. And so by saying that, I'm also saying that this inner spirit, this thing that is being called to, this genius, this daimon, is not usually a part of religion either. It's actually this unique thing that makes each person worthy of respect, care, and love, because they are unique and will never be born again. And it's a hard thing in the modern world, but it's actually a valuable thing to begin to imagine oneself that way, not to be inflated because everyone else is that way. Oscar Wilde said something like, be yourself because everyone else is taken. In two little lines, he has the whole idea there. Be your unique self because everyone else is a unique self. And I'm going back to thinking about children and younger people. When they see an older person living in what appears to be a meaningful way with an enlivened spirit in their life and being kind of unique and possibly weird, they're encouraged. Because inside they have a feeling for that, but they haven't been shown or been given permission or been invited into living that way. But when they see someone doing it, they recognize it. Until a person hears the call and responds to the call, then the key elements of their own psyche and their soul remain latent or dormant or hidden. And so that a person can inherit wealth or gain great status in the world, and yet they can feel and be empty inside because they have no genuine sense of their inner worth. And if that's the case, then they have very little to offer to other people despite wealth or fame or power. You could say another issue with hearing and responding to the call is an issue of courage, because it takes a certain kind of courage to follow what truly calls to us. It usually doesn't agree with the family dynamics and the family expectations, and it certainly doesn't agree with our inner psychological structure, the ego, or I call it the little self. In other words, if we're going to hear the call and respond to it, we're going to have to move beyond the limitations of the ego, beyond the expectations of the ego, and we're going to have to face the fears of the ego, because the calling calls a person to a necessarily bigger life in psychological terms and in spiritual terms and in emotional terms. So even though everyone has a calling, it's easier to walk a predictable path and follow the maps made by others than to find the courage to step onto that pathless path that turns out to be the path that we were called to take. And so that's why, one reason why I'm saying that when the world is falling apart, when life becomes dark and uncertain, there's more reason to follow a calling, because the expected things, the secure things, the safe pathways aren't existing anyway. So then why not go the whole hog and step off the map and go into the places where we are called, which are always, the calling always takes us off the maps that are made by others. So, and just to repeat, we have to, in some sense, loosen our ego attitudes in order to make room for the calling and the vision of our own lives to be able to enter the space and affect our psychological inner territory. And so those things that cause the ego to be stuck or break down actually make us more available to calling. And so if we're going to look back through our lives to see when did the calling happen or where might it have happened, you can look in places where something really bright happened, and maybe it was only momentary, and then we lost the grip on it, or people took it away from us, I don't know. But also you can look where the worst things happened, where we were rejected, we were locked up, we had a breakdown. And how we survived that, if we really examine it, will often have traces and hints of the calling and the inner genius. And so one place to look for where the calling might have been, in other words, by the time a person is early 20s, they've experienced the call whether they know it or not. In other words, this is not a matter of options and choices. It happens. But because of all the things I was naming, the limitations of family, the kind of lack of imagination in culture, the restrictions of poverty, the rejections because of gender or because of lifestyle, all those kind of things can get in the way of realizing that the calling had come. And then we have to go back into those broken places and perhaps find the root or the seed or the remnant of the calling there. Going back over one's life to see, because when the calling occurs, it leaves a mark. It leaves its own trace. And so we can trace back to find the calling because it leaves traces in our lives. Having said that, it's necessary for me at least to say that a person's calling is not necessarily heroic. The modern Western world has become, somewhat obsessed with the notion of heroicism, the hero's journey, the hero's myth, and Joseph Campbell, who was a great person and did a lot of good work, made the mistake of calling it a monomyth. And what I mean by a mistake is myth is multiple by its own nature. There is no single story. There's the multiplicity of stories. And so the calling doesn't necessarily call a person into a hero's journey. It can call a person into all kinds of things that don't look like that at all. And so, and once again, when the world is falling apart, we don't need more heroes. The heroicism of the Western mind is partly what has us in the trouble we're in, the exaggerated sense of heroics. Calling is not dependent on notions of the hero. It's closer to creation myths than it is to heroes' journeys. And creation myths come in all kinds of forms and shapes, just as the callings come in all kinds of forms and shapes. And what calls to a person, again, is unique, and it cannot be defined by a simple number of steps or be recognized by certain expectations. It can have its own unique style and its own way of getting our attention. And the thing, our own inner spirit, has its own style. So people can be called onto a similar journey, but they will each live it uniquely, and they will each bring a different style to it, just the way that every cello player has a different style, as every flute player does, and every dancer does. So let's see. There's no general map to follow, and that makes the whole prospect of calling more mysterious and makes it more necessary to reflect more deeply, to find the traces of calling and to learn what we're being called to do. Okay. Failing to answer the call can cause a depression of spirit. The call is calling to the unique spirit of the person. Failing to answer it can naturally cause a depression of spirit. As a matter of fact, the word depression used to mean a loss of spirit. And at the same time, spirit and soul are both expecting and awaiting the call. And then failing to respond to the call has a damaging effect, depressing effect on the spirit and also on the soul. Failing to answer the call means to live an unexplored life, to have the key territory of one's inner life be not explored. And it can also sadly mean dying without having fully lived. So in a sense, either we awaken to the true nature and inner spirit of our life by responding to the call, or we wind up living a distortion or a perversion of it. I'm making this extreme because, in a sense, that's how it is for the soul. The callings pull us into extreme places where we have to expand our sense of self, and we have to open our hearts and our minds and our bodies to being understood in a way that's different from what culture says and family says and our own ego says. The calling calls us into a greater adventure, which they used to call the second adventure of life. The first adventure is just to be born and to survive infancy and to grow as the body grows. And the second adventure is to hear the call and awaken to the journey, to the path, to the elements of our own life that are intended to unfold into the world.